living is part of the ancient homeland and traditional territory of the Lenni Lenape people. We pay respect to the Lenni Lenape people, past, present, and future, and their continuing presence in their homeland and in the diaspora. We also acknowledge the millions of enslaved Africans and their descendants on whose backs this nation was created. Our mission statement. Not in our town, Princeton is a multiracial, multi-faith group of individuals who stand together for racial justice and inclusive communities. Our focus is to promote the equitable treatment of all and to uncover and confront white supremacy, the system that facilitates the preference, privilege, and power of white people at the expense of non-white people, and pits racial and ethnic groups against each other by upholding hierarchies based on proximity to whiteness. Our goal is to identify and expose the political, economical, and cultural systems which have enabled white supremacy to flourish, and to create new structures and policies which will ensure equity and inclusion for all. In our commitment to uncovering the blight, in our commitment to uncovering the blight of white supremacy on our humanity, we take responsibility to address it and to eliminate it in all its forms through intentional actions, starting with ourselves and our communities. Connie is going to introduce our magnificent speaker for this evening. So Connie, please take it away. Thank you.
I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Stephanie James Harris, who's the Executive Director of the New Jersey Amistad Commission, a division of the Department of Education. Dr. Harris is dedicated to using historical and cultural teaching tools to reveal an accurate and inclusive view of American history. She has a Bachelor's of Arts degree in English with a specialization in African American literature and a Bachelor's of Science degree in African American Studies from the University of Maryland, College Park. She earned both her master's and doctorate from Temple University, Philadelphia, in the Department of Africology and African American Studies. We're also very happy to announce that Dr. James Harris will be doing a free virtual professional development on the Amistad curriculum for teachers. We're very grateful for her kindness and generosity. It will be during the final week of February, and we would really appreciate your help in spreading the word. We'll be announcing the time and dates soon, and please stay tuned for more details. Thank you very much.
Hello. Hi, everybody. I thank you very much for allowing me to be here. I thank you for the time and for the opportunity to talk about the Amistad legislation, most especially in a town that really and truly was one of the first when we operationalized the law and began the work of really looking at school district implementation and how it could work, and really some case study works. This town, the Township School District of Princeton, that was really at the forefront and really made sure that it was fully operationalized. And also in a town that is noted for its famous integration plan that stems, of course, from 1948, that actually became a resolution or solution for a lot of school districts across the nation, which of course is the infamous Princeton plan. And we've learned a lot from that integration plan in regards to whether or not just simply moving people in places is enough. Is that truly integration? Well, I think in regards of talking about the Amistad Commission, the Amistad Law, I want to keep that premise and those thoughts in mind, because I think that the real lesson from the Princeton plan is also the lesson that we've learned about the work of the Amistad Commission in its full fidelity and what it means. And we need to be very mindful of the intentionalities that needs to be put into place. That does not mean that we're simply adding or moving things without really thinking about a full integration and infusion of things, righting some wrongs and creating some really equitable spaces. We all know that the misnomer from the Princeton plan is that it did not stigmatize some of the inequities that happened from school to school. And so, yes, you can move children into school buildings, but if you're not going to deal with the social implications, the racial implications, maybe the social economic implications, the structural implications that follow those students and the ideologies that come with them and the realities that are harbored with them, then what are you doing except for moving chess pieces around the board? And so the Amistad Law and the Amistad Commission has really been about making sure that there is a full space of inclusion and infusion. The Amistad Law that, of course, passed exactly 20 years ago in August of 2002, is the first law in the nation that actually effectuated an entire content area statewide. The law stipulated that Afro-American history would be included and infused throughout the entirety of K-12 curriculum, most especially in the first narration of the law in social studies and the humanities. In the second narration of the law, the updates to the law, it actually expanded and allowed it to be in all spaces applicable, and really looking at an expansion that these content areas should not just be things pushed in special spaces, but something that is throughout the entirety of the K-12 curricula, not in special moments, not in specifically Afro-American history programming, but really and truly throughout. And I think in the operation of the law, as we had a chance to kind of sit back and look at it, we recognized that we did not also want it to become a silo or a space in which people began to think that we would all become hierarchy and crabs in a barrel about who we're going to be first, if we're all going to be kind of looking at this histories as, making sure that there was inclusions of marginalized people. So I think the real beauty of the Amistad Law is it allowed us to deconstruct places in which people were marginalized and making sure that we demarginalize them and we include them back into the narrative. And so it gave us the space to reopen and redo and reconstruct curricula and cross the plan. So I had somebody ask a question about what the Princeton plan was. So I'm going to tell you what the Princeton plan is, because I assumed everybody who lived in Princeton would know what the Princeton plan is. I'll back up just for 1 second. But the fact that we could demarginalize and really look at how social studies could be implemented and how curricula could be written that would allow for people to be placed in the rightful space across curricula, that we did not superimpose people, but we understood that history is often the recording of today's events for tomorrow's students. And because of that fact, who chooses who is to be recorded, what stories they record, what narrations, what social political leanings, what perspective is recorded, becomes extremely important for students to really understand the collective contribution that might have happened today. But if those things are not done, if we don't look at that in regards to the inclusions of literature or the sciences or the mathematicians or any of these other areas, and not just in social studies, the people, places, and things that we often have children memorize as they recount our historical memory of this nation and the history of this globe, then they'll never get a full sense of all of our collective participation, and they will never truly be able to be the global thinkers with full appreciation for the children that are sitting to the left and right of them, or maybe not sitting to the left and right of them, even more interestingly, and for the people that they will encounter for the rest of their days. And that is extremely important. Let me back up a little bit for the Princeton plan, and I'm going to play local historian for you all today. In 1948, well, I'll back up a couple years before that. In Trenton, New Jersey, in 1943, there was a infamous legal case, and most people, the thing for me about history, what I love about history is the causation. And we don't teach students that. We often teach students in regards of episodes. So students learn a particular incident. They don't understand the interconnections of it. They don't understand the reality of how things have happened on top of each other and what is the result of something. So the causation of a particular fact is often left out of the equations. We have students memorize particular incidents, which also does not allow them to really see the large swath of the influences or, the results of something, the causations of something, the effects of something, either preceding or subsequent to any particular action. They move on to the next incident or moment that they memorize. So for Princeton, a lot of the Princeton plan connotates coming out of what happens in Trenton. Hedgepath-Williams becomes an extremely pivotal case. Now, New Jersey's constitution, dating back to the 1840s, had said that all students would be, irrespective of race, and it's very specific about race, would be, allowed a thorough and efficient education. So New Jersey was never supposed to legally, by de jure, have segregated schools. But we understand by the 1870s, New Jersey is the first state and the only state north of the Mason-Dixon line that is actually running a state-mandated segregated school, segregated boarding school, most especially for southern New Jersey towns, the Boarding Town Manual Training School, for the alternative for all of these small South Jersey schools that do not have the resources nor the population to feel that they want to build their own specific colored high school. And so they're sending them to Boarding Town Manual Training School, a residential school run by the State Board of Education that runs from the 1870s all the way until 1954. Oh, I'm sorry, I was reading the message. So 1954, and so it wasn't until it was not able to be fully integrated, which is why it ironically closed. But out of that Hedgepath-Williams decision, and because of the reality of the state constitution, when the African American populations and two particular parents, Mrs. Hedgepath and Mrs. Williams, sued because their children were not permitted to go to the school in the neighborhood, the new school that was built, the junior high school, were being sent all the way across the city of Trenton to the colored high school, which is illegal. And so because the NAACP had looked at other cases, such as what had happened with Mendez Westminster in California, where that desegregated the school district, amazingly, when we talk about causation, the chief justice, the governor at the time in California was Earl Warren, who of course goes on for Brown versus Board and is at that time sitting at the Supreme Court. So he had already desegregated California schools, who had a very similar state constitution. And Hedgepath and Williams, the parents, took a class action suit with the NAACP at the helm, and they desegregated Princeton Public Schools. In Princeton, looking at it and recognizing that there would be even stronger language in the 1948 state constitutional rewrite, recognized that it was time to desegregate, I believe it was Witherspoon School, which was the colored school there in town. And so what they decided to do was a creative plan, which is one that has been replicated across the nation. So in the 1940s, what they did was, instead of necessarily having a neighborhood school, they shifted it so that I believe it's grade bands or grade cohorts of students go to particular schools. And so I don't know if it still is going on in Princeton, but I know how it was replicated across in a lot of other districts is that there was a particular school for K through 2, and then a particular school for 3, 4, and middle school, and et cetera, which meant that allowed the African-American students at Witherspoon to attend other schools. And it integrated Princeton School District in 1948. It became known as the Princeton Plan, and other districts replicated it across the nation. But what it did not do is it simply just pushed the students in. It didn't necessarily push their teachers in. It did not shift the context of even curricula. It did not even really think about what their social and emotional space would be. It did not necessarily come with all the support systems that would be needed. It did not look at anything else other than the fact that it would integrate the classroom. And if that was okay on the surface, we understand that we simply throwing students into a particular circumstance without thinking with full intentionality of framing it out to support it completely is always a mistake. And I guess for me, that's why I use it as one of the things that becomes an example for me in regards of Amistad. This is not a space where we should just be throwing information into the curricula. I do not ever want to see a school district just begin to say, okay, well, let me just go figure out for students where I can throw some people, places, and things into curricula and be able to say that I have quote unquote integrated it or if I've expanded it without really thinking about how you mesh those conversations, how you're able to talk about the collective discourse with students about how it looks when it is there, without really thinking about the support systems for teachers who might not be familiar with the law or what this looks like, without them having the space of really having the training, without them even having the space to be able to know how to have those conversations, to be able to ask the difficult questions. History is difficult. It's supposed to be. It is a story of us. And we are in all of our multi-dimensionalities, with all of our contradictions, with all of our messy. It is who we are. But yet too often people want to tie it up into a nice little bow on at the end of a unit or on a Friday afternoon and test and have everybody see the end. And it is messy. And because of that, the real gist of social studies education is to teach students how to think critically, ask questions of the world, to read, to analyze, to strategize, to become thinkers and leaders, to be critical in their critiques, to not to be accepting of everything on surface value, to understand that even our textbooks, social political tools with social political leanings, and nothing in our education systems, very little things are in fact objective. They are all created by someone who will have a subjective opinion. The idea of using primary sources and being able to see and hear from people, understanding their times, their influences, the whys, the hows of how they write it, is about how we are socializing our children into the world. And so that should be messy. That should come with the space of some discourse and some pull and tug, because we're expanding them. And it's our jobs as educators is to do that. We should never want to shy away from that. It is the space of our greatest discourse, and it is also the space of our greatest uncomfort. And I will say thirdly, that what I have learned over the course of my now 16-year history with the Amistad Commission, it is probably one of the most political decisions that we don't discuss, or we did not discuss, I guess, before this year, when we've had so many discussions about critical race, and we've looked at school boards and all the polarization that has happened in regards to curriculum and instruction, whether or not we want our children to be uncomfortable with things or learn different things. You know, there's a recognition that one of the most political decisions is the choice of curricula. Who chooses it? How it is chosen? But what I do want to say on the other side of that coin, I definitely believe that one of the most important decisions we can make as a nation is what we choose to put into or not put into our children. Because that is going to shift the discourse on who they are in the next generation, how they think, how they're able to strategize, how they see the world, how they make their decision making. And we are the ones going to be responsible for those decisions, because based on the things that we choose to do today. The Amistad, state of New Jersey, has really been at the forefront of this work and really thinking about with full intentionality what that means. How do we teach our children? What should we include with our children to really have a full understanding of who we are? So I am quickly going to show you mandate, so you can see what it is. So the Amistad Commission, the primary goals of the commission is to infuse the literature, a history of African Americans into the curriculum in order to provide an accurate, complete, and inclusive history, but through professional development and in-service workshops and residential summer institutes, to evaluate appropriate use of primary and secondary resources, make suggestions for them. We create curriculum materials that help to teach effectively, content aligned to the revised social studies core content standards and our learning objectives and standards. We assist school districts when they need the assistance, and we also create lesson plans in accordance with subject areas using the web-based curriculum resource, which is our online textbook for teachers. We help to make the awareness of the importance of African American histories to the growth and development of American society in a global context. So we are consistently helping to develop curriculum maps to disseminate it, and the materials to every school in the state to make sure that they are aware. We do all kinds of professional development trainings, because one of the things that we've learned from the more than 619 school districts across the state, both private, public, and parochial, is that it is not that teachers do not want to do the work. It's that teachers are big students, and the reality of what coursework they've had, what exposures they've had, how they were taught is a big influence in how they teach, most especially when I have more than 63 textbooks now sitting in my office at the Department of Education that are in circulation in New Jersey. And because of the fact that New Jersey's was so sort of ahead of the game in regards of how this is done, not one of the textbooks that sit there actually does a full infusion. Most of them actually are still siloing a lot of marginalized people's contributions and stories to text boxes which highlight particular people, which makes them look exceptionalist as opposed to being normative, or they're handled outside the parameters in special topics or et cetera, or they're mere mentions rather than integrating it, infusing their stories throughout. It's almost ironic that the same textbooks companies that actually publish course books in Afro-American history or women's history, et cetera, have never thought, probably don't even need to give them the idea of actually integrating all those books into one, because that would actually be an infused curriculum. We have all these siloed histories that we get very good about really creating spaces for curriculum, but they don't blend them. And so our space for the web-based curriculum resource, the ability for us to be able to really understand that the major crutch for a lot of teachers was curricula, and the web-based curriculum resource was our online textbook for teachers, or the resource for teachers in schools. It's free of charge, we disseminate it, we can train on it, it's online so that it can consistently be upgraded. But it is our resource to be able to look at the holes in the standard United States history or world history or civics and social studies textbooks most specifically, and also in the content areas of ELA or English language arts, to really think about what holes are missing if we were going to make sure that students understood a full narrative. And so by mandate, the Amistad Commission, we are in but not of the Department of Education. So we demand and we are there to work with the Department of Education and with all New Jersey school districts to assist their efforts in identifying and evaluating curriculum materials and textbooks which integrate the infusion of history and contributions of African American slavery and the decisions of slavery into their curricula. Now this slide is one I use a lot with teachers. And I use it on purpose because one of my absolute favorite TED Talks is about a concept called windows and mirrors. In fact, I think I might use a portion of it when I do the training, the in-service with you all later on in the month. But this is the concept, without giving too much away from the training. That curricula is supposed to do two things, and I'm going to add a third thing at my next slide. But the curricula and what education is supposed to do. It is supposed to give a space where students are able to see themselves reflected back to them so that they understand who they are, and they can see themselves mirrored in it, and it mirrors them. But it also is supposed to give them a window into the world. It's supposed to happen at the same time, which is why I love this photograph, because they're both happening, kind of simultaneously. You can look out the window or you can look in the mirror. That is what curricula is supposed to do. And when it does not allow itself to represent all marginalized people, when we are still having spaces where people are feeling that they're pushed to the outers, then you'll often find the curriculum does one of the other things without doing both of them well. It either reflects back for a population of the students something that mirrors them, and it gives all the rest of the students a window into their world, or it really and truly harms the students that are being, in that space, only mirrored back to themselves, because it denies them the opportunity to have a window into others' world, which means we're not creating students that have a sense of empathy, a sense of others' experiences, a sense of what other realities are, a sense of all of the spaces in which they might be in positions of privilege or disadvantage and what that might mean. And if we don't have students even understand what that means, then how in the world do we expect them in the next generation to be able to solve the problems, to be able to deconstruct those things, if we are educating them to be blind to them? This is my third criteria to what I believe the Amistad Commission is doing, the work is doing, and also what curriculum should always do. I believe it creates a sliding door. And I love this particular photograph, actually from Anderson Windows, which I love the windows and I love the siding on this house. But I love the demographics of those that are engaging in conversation. Because what it meant is that this group came through the door. They came through the glass, they came through the mirrors, and they actually sat down. So it not only allowed a space where there was a window into the world, but the sliding door allowed us to go back and forth in and out of others' world so that we can create interconnections, which is a necessity for where we need to go collectively together. And how do we do that? Oftentimes we run summer institutes for teachers. We make sure that there's materials that are shifted every year, conversations and discourses from different spaces of the curriculum mappings that are done in the school districts. And we bring teachers together so that they can spend some time actually delving into curricula, where it is a deep dive into it. Every summer they're held, they are free of charge. Their teachers get almost on the average between 40 and 50 professional development hours for it. In past years, before our COVID reality, they were residential, or they had an option for residential and or commuter. We housed everybody in accommodations on college campuses, and we really took them back to school with not only first-person narrative, but making sure that they went back to their districts with resources, with all the lectures. And we tried to make sure that if we could take them on some experiential experiences to actually be in spaces of history. In the last 2 years, and more than likely probably in some hybrid form this upcoming summer, we have done it virtually. Last summer we actually did it as a hybrid. The topic last summer was History Beneath Our Feet. And it was a space in which we really looked at New Jersey history, specifically because I found that other than in fourth grade, and it seemed to be covered most extensively, by the time students got to high school, or really were looking at historical narratives, or even their ELA or social studies and the things that were covered, unless a local history rose to national prominence, students had a large disconnection with the history that resided right here with us. For example, a lot of students of Princeton, I would be curious to know how many of them knew about the Princeton plan and what it meant. I'd be curious to know about whether or not they knew about the fact that Princeton University had slave quarters. I would be curious to know if they knew where they were. I'd be curious to know whether they knew about the Witherspoon School corridor, Witherspoon area. I would be curious to know if they knew about the reality of the global giant history of Paul Robeson was there. I'd be curious to know if they knew about even the history of the churches or the advocacy that went on. I would be curious to know about whether or not they knew about even the college policies that happened at Princeton University in regards of how they effectuated other Ivy League campuses in the early part of the 1910s when President Wilson was president of Princeton. These are local histories that actually become a part of the national narrative that could be used as an example, but oftentimes students did not know and teachers did not know it. So we spent some time crossing through New Jersey, picking up some sites, being able to look at it as an American colony that actually had enslavement and plantations and everything else, really thinking about what that meant, thinking about the rise of the Quakers and the African American towns in the South, but also, the firm entrenchment of plantation systems in Monmouth County and Bergen County. And we looked at, the first African American country clubs, and, we looked at the slave ports and where they were. We took teachers to them so they could actually do there. We looked at the markers. We talked about, the histories beneath our feet. We had a number of school districts and school children that had done some projects that I had worked with them last Black History Month that actually had created townships websites and things about the places and things that they had no idea were right there. So that is the subject of the Summer Institute. And of course, the application usually opens around April, and I would encourage teachers or stakeholders to please join in. We try to make it as full and interesting as possible, and we really love your participation. These are some lists of some resources that we brought together just for the summer so that you can just kind of see a sampling of what we're able to do. I don't know how many more sheets. So I want to talk a little bit before the time is 7:30. I don't want to hold you too much time, but I want to talk about implementation and some of the strategies and some of the things that become the misnomers for a lot of districts in regards of when they think about how to do this level of work. So the reality of the Amistad Law is that the first notation for the law is that all school boards should adopt. And that is a short sentence that has a huge implication in regards of how Amistad is done. New Jersey is a state of home rule. And oftentimes we think that a state law is the fix-all. And the caveat for that is that because we have local control and we are so heavily invested in local control, and we have a school board system in this state, that nothing can be done at the state level in regards of truly formulating enforcement tactics on a school district without local school board adoption. I can say that Princeton School District adopted the Amistad mandate back in 2007 when we actually won. Princeton was one of the first schools that actually adopted it, actually won an exemplary award for the work. I think it was Constance Escher who won it for Witherspoon Schools. She did a district-wide project, won an award from the commission, a cash award to help her institutionalize it across the district. I know that there was a great deal of work at Princeton High School that was drilled down and scaffolded down. At the time, I don't know if it's still there, but scaffolded down into the middle and elementary schools in regards to a full implementation plan and infusion plan with resources. I do believe, I think because I looked it up earlier, it is still on Princeton's website. I'm curious as to know how much is actually utilized and how much is still operationalized. But the school board mandate is actually what gives this mandate its teeth. Because once it is adopted by the school board, it is in the school district wheelhouse. And so therefore it becomes the accountability structure for the school board, superintendent, the curriculum directors, the teachers can be held accountable for this work. And that is really the crutch of full implementation. This is something that should not just be in special programming, but really should be across the board. And we need to see it infused into the curriculum and instruction. My job is to assist the school district. I could do any kind of evaluations, evaluation tools, audits, suggestions. I can come in and do their classes. For instance, I've done many districts. In fact, I was actually just in a school district earlier today. I was in Pleasantville in South Jersey, right outside of Atlantic City, model teaching for some of their middle school, 8th grade classes. I put them together and I've been doing some model lessons so they can just understand how to infuse and how this might be able to work, most especially because the 8th grade teachers were kind of concerned about how to scale or also how to have certain conversations with their students. I did their model teaching for them. So my job is to assist and also evaluate. I'm also part of the QSEC team, the Quality Single Accountability Continuum, the accountability measures, self-reporting accountability measures that school districts go through every couple of years. Princeton, because of the quality of the school, might not, I don't know whether or not you guys had an exemption or whether or not you have gone through your quality assessments. Some districts, because they are considered much more highly effective, don't have to go through them, which actually I think is a disservice because it does not allow you to do delving into curriculum. You would be shocked at some of the districts that you would assume have done curriculum updates. And because they don't have to go through the QSEC evaluations, when you finally get in, and it might be 6 years or 10 years down the road, have never updated curriculum. So I'd be curious as to find out whether or not Princeton is in that boat. I have not done a QSEC from Princeton yet, but Amistad was just added to the QSEC in regards to the accountability measure and a checkpoint for a zero-sum game for curriculum instruction approximately 2.5 years ago, which means that if they cannot give artifactual and evaluative demonstration of an infused curriculum that satisfies to the satisfaction of the Department of Ed, they will get 0 of their curriculum points. Now, there are large scale and vast differentials in what that means and what they see. There is no universal curriculum. There's a lot of model curriculums, there's no universal. So each school district can interpret what that means differently. But we all understand about what would be on the surface level or what is actually a deep dive and when we begin to see real shifts and changes. And so that CUSAC becomes really the state's space in which to really have an opportunity to really delve in and deconstruct and really look at, deeply at what has been done, what is has evolved, and what is available to the students at Princeton. And so we have part of the CUSAC team, the school board must adopt, and of course we're available to do any kind of assistance with it and also with any kind of professional development. I think I gave you a pretty good overview, at least of what the Amistad is, what some of our offerings are, and sort of where we fit into the largest scale development for a school district's particular curriculum map. Each district creates their own curriculum map. Jersey does not have universal curriculum. Unlike other states like Tennessee or Virginia, where you can move from Princeton to Haddonfield to Cherry Hill to Montclair to Monmouth to Newark or etc. If that was universal, if you're in Virginia and that's the case, when you go from Charlottesville to Reston to Hampton to anywhere across the state of Virginia, within a couple of days, your student is going to be on the same curriculum map. They map out the universals. New Jersey is not that way. Each particular school district has a jurisdiction to choose create their own curriculum map, as long as they're staying to the auspices of the standards so that those students can be tested, which means there's a lot of leeway in what it looks from district to district, which makes the work of these commissions that are actually talking about effectuating content areas a little more problematic, or maybe just a little more challenging. Finally, I'm going to conclude with this. I welcome the ability for the engagement of other people that have felt their deficit in curriculum are now adding to this narrative and this conversation. Passage of several laws in the last several years that have joined the Amistad Commission, the Holocaust Commission, the Italian American Commission has been just wonderful for me. To really understand that our students are going to be engaged in a full complement of understanding, and that all of our blind spots can be eradicated by making sure that with full intentionality, there will be a multitude of offices that will make this their central focus. And each one of these offices can lend themselves to the curriculum maps of each one of these school districts. It makes me leap for joy. I know that Ms. Mitchell is, Gail Mitchell, who was on the call, was in our first cohort of our summer institute. And I don't know if she remembers this, but I will share this with her. Oh, LGBT, thank you. I appreciate that. LGBTQ curriculums as well, and their commissions and their work as well. Equal representation for everyone so that we can all be seen and represented in the curricula, because we've all participated in this American story. We did not just get here, we've been here. When I started this work, and at the very first summer institute, my boys were with me. My sons at the time were 4 and 5. Actually, a little younger than that. They just started school. And I said to the teachers that were there, is that I wanted us all to understand the historic moment we were in. And I believe I brought my children in the room and I said that if we did this right, if we really understood the full nature and the global implications of what we were doing, and that we could lead the way for this work, then the classrooms that my children sit in as they go through K through 12 as public school students in New Jersey, in a wonderful school district where I really felt very comfortable about the teaching and teachers, but understanding that no matter how comfortable I felt, I knew that my responsibility as their mother, as an African-American mother, as a historian, as one that understood that there were deficits in the curriculum, as one that understood and had been taught by an African-American educator and mother herself, my mother being a administrator and a teacher for 40 plus years in Philadelphia. There were many things that she had to teach me at home so that I could become who I needed to become. And so I understood that I would have to do the same work for my children. But we had the opportunity to be able to level the playing field. And for the children that did not have the benefit of having a me or my mother, that they would shift the discourse. Well, my children are now a senior and sophomore in college. And we are still struggling with getting this work done. They've made great strides, but I can say with some sadness that they went through their entirety of K through 12, with me still having to address teachers, even sometimes having to send in the law because I didn't realize who the mommy was of this teacher, this student that was asking all these questions about the coursework or sending suggestions in or having their friends come over and helping them prepare for AP tests where I'm bringing other resources out. I became the tutor mom after swim practice on many days after pickup because I understood the importance of what this law did. And I said, if the teachers weren't going to do it in their classroom, and this is in my own personal school district, and it was my job to do. I think we need to all take that sense of responsibility because I cannot afford for my now niece and nephew, who are now in 1st and 3rd grade, to graduate out of high school. And we are still struggling with this. This should be a no-brainer in 2022. Philosophically, we say we all agree with it, and yet we struggle with having to operationalize it. We've got to do it full intentionalities, and the best way for us all to do it is to do it together. And so my one ask of all of you, if you're in Princeton or not, ask the school board, ask them about the Amistad legislation and the infusion. Ask them what the curriculum map looks like. Ask them what the professional development days are. Ask them about the resources and the literatures that they read. And do not be afraid for allowing your students to become critical thinkers by exposing them to things. See, the real magic of teaching is not that you're afraid of them reading it. It's that you couch the conversation and you create the support systems around it so that they understand it. Because they can't be critical thinkers if everything around them only gives a singular message, which I think is the beauty of this work. Students that we can create out of it will be such change agents for tomorrow. They're going to knock our socks off. So I'll end there.
Wow, thank you so much, Dr. James Harris. That was a really wonderful, powerful talk. And thank you for agreeing to take some questions. So since there's a large number of us, if you could either raise your hand or put your question in the chat. There was one question in the chat already about, does the school board decide what students have in their curriculum?
The school board doesn't necessarily decide, well, the school board doesn't decide what's in the curriculum. The school board is responsible for setting the policy. So the policy change would be adopting the Amistad legislation. So if the school board adopts legislation, then it becomes their responsibility. So the curriculum office, the superintendent, the curriculum specialist, there's usually an internal curriculum team that will create the curriculum map and the curriculum and the resources and et cetera. And usually during the spring, or if they're doing an update, it will come before the school board for approval. Now, I was the vice president of my town's school board for a number of years. And it has private and parochial schools as well. And so their school boards as well, their bodies, their governing bodies have to adopt as well. That would be the way in which for private and parochials as well. And charters, which is, of course, is public. So as the vice president of my school board, I knew that one of the things that became very difficult, and they hated me and they loved me at the same time, is because we got into minutia of fights about oftentimes the bid for the contract for the turf on the soccer field, and it would take hours. And yet when the curriculum vote came before us, it was a 30-second vote, and no one actually really oftentimes delved into it. So, and they would vote up and down because, of course, they trusted or the experts that they had hired to do the work, which I totally understand. So they're not necessarily drafting it, but they are responsible for approving it. And once they've adopted it as a mandate, if it is not there and they vote for something that does not have it there, they're actually in violation of themselves as a governing body. I hope that makes sense.
Can you give us a toolkit of what to say when we go to the school board?
Yes, I can. And actually, there is a document, and I don't have it on my computer, but I can probably ask in my office of some questions that we had created to ask. And usually, first I can guarantee if they're aware of this Amistad law and the implications, most times they'll say we have it, and some people stop there. You have a right to see curriculum. So you can ask, and sometimes it's on public. It might actually, your curriculum might actually be up on your school district website. You can actually go and look, and you can ask, so where are the spaces in which the Holocaust Commission has been integrated, or the mandates, because they're not curriculums. I need to make that very specifically. It's not a packaged curriculum. It is actually requires the work of the district to really think about adding to their own curriculum maps and really thinking about the nuances of people, places, things, incidents, perspectives, books, et cetera, and it's expensive. So it cannot be packaged in something they can just drop in. But you can ask them, where do you feel like this? Or, the standards have been written where they'll ask very generalized questions, because we looked at even creating the standards and recognized that if we put it to specificity, if we had it where districts were, kind of being able to benchmark these 5 names, then we understood that those 5 names would be the 5 things we'd see all across the state. But most districts would not go any farther than that. And so the reality of the way in which most of the standards are written, it allows for the expansion and the additive of additional people and places and nuances and things and et cetera, that are not just linked to to particular demarkers. And so I don't even know where my question went, but I think I just answered it.
Thank you. Linda, you had your hand up.
Yes, thank you. And thank you so much, Dr. James Harris. It was really inspirational. I have a question that's somewhat specific, but I think it connects with what you've been telling us. And it's something that I learned relatively recently. That was about Ona Judge.
Yes.
And when I learned about this woman who was enslaved to George and Martha Washington, escaped, was pursued by them more than once to
They
be
had to stop him.
re-enslaved.
They said it was embarrassing as a president. They actually stopped him from doing it because
Mainly George's thing. I'm sorry.
Exactly. Yes, exactly. I see you doing. I didn't realize you were there. So I will share with you that prior to taking this position, I was the Director of Education and Public Programs at the African American Museum in Philadelphia, which is probably about 1 block north of where Miss Judge resided and lived, at the president's mansion in Philadelphia, which is directly behind the Liberty Bell.
Mhm.
They now have a glass partition, because when they were redoing the grass in the park of the Liberty Bell, they recognized, they didn't realize that was the kitchen. And then they realized that the materials that they were pulling out of the ground had stopped the actual construction, and they made it an excavation site. They did an archaeological dig, and then they recognized that what they would end up doing is that they will just put plexiglass over top of it, so you can actually see the ground and see some of the materials are inside. And they built the structure of the kitchen, so you know where it was. It's a very interesting story, because the reality of Pennsylvania law dictated that if someone was enslaved and brought into the state of Pennsylvania and stayed there more than 6 months, that they were in fact be freed under Pennsylvania law. And so President Washington brought Ona Judge and his cook Hercules, both of them, to Philadelphia with him to the presidential mansion. And on 5 months and 3 weeks, he would send them back to Virginia for a day, 2 days, a month, whatever time, and bring them back so that they would virtue never be free. And Ona because of virtue of being right there in the center of Philadelphia and the reality of, this is the time in which the same time parameter in which the abolitionist movement is starting there. You have the Free African Society that's beginning there. You have the reality of, the Quakers beginning to, the first petitions in Burlington and then being adopted by the Quakers in Germantown. There is understanding the power of the Pennsylvania law. And so what she does is that she is hidden and disappears on the eve of her next departure to Virginia. And she manages to stay in Philadelphia beyond the time. And she is transported to New Hampshire, where she gets married, because New Hampshire at that point was the only state that had done a gradual emancipation law, because all 13 of them were enslaved states prior to the Revolutionary War. But New Hampshire's emancipation law, graduation was immediate. So everyone else did gradual emancipation, which did not free them immediately, except for New Hampshire. And so she knew that by virtue of the New Hampshire state constitution, she would be free. And so she resided there. And George Washington combed the United States for her. And the fugitive slave law that most of us only associate with the 1850s is in actuality one of the baselines of the United States Constitution. It's Article 2, Section 9 or 11 or something to that effect. I'm sure Dwayne probably could tell me, but it's right there. And it says the states that you must return. And so he wanted to evoke the fugitive slave law to return his enslaved property. And it was scandal for the 1790s in Philadelphia.
Wow.
We know that the schools are going to teach about George Washington. My feeling is when children learn about George Washington, they have to learn about Ona Judge at the same time. Would you agree with that?
I would. And, and Hercules, they had a children's book out a couple of years ago. I know Ona Judge, they just wrote the book. The professor just wrote the book. I believe she was at Rutgers, and now I think she's in Virginia. There's a children's book about Hercules, because Hercules was a world famous chef, and he was known for his recipes. And he was actually, after Ona escaped, they thought it was a conspiracy. So Hercules ended up being never to return to Philadelphia, and actually was sent out to the fields. This is someone that was trained to be a renowned chef, actually ended up in the fields. Back in, oh my God, I always forget. I want to say Monticello, but it's not Monticello. What is Washington's plantation in Virginia?
Mount Vernon.
Mount Vernon, thank you. He actually ends up in the fields of Mount Vernon. So there's a children's book that actually talks about Hercules and his recipes, and how famous they were. Hercules is actually one of the creators of, if you watch High on the Hog, if anybody watched that, the history of African American foods, he's actually attributed the original recipe of macaroni and cheese. So, I mean, there are legacies that are left there. But again, most of us don't talk about almost all of the original 16 presidents up until the Civil War being slaveholders. We don't want to talk about that complicated history, but they were men of their times. A lot of them were Southern men, because of the reality of even the law structured with the 3/5 compromise, with the electoral college votes, etc. And so students do need to understand that, because they need to understand a discourse, especially in the election we just had, on what the 3/5 compromise did, how we chose electoral college, why it's even possible. It seems like an antiquated system today because we don't have an enslaved population. So because we had an enslaved population, that number meant something in regards to representation, and representation for what? That's what students need to understand. House of Representatives, a presidential vote, therefore effectuating our Supreme Court. That's something that's a piece of civics history that students don't understand, and how much it was baked into our American history. That should not be problematic, and we should not run from that narrative. It makes students understand the circumstances of why we're here today, and then be able to think critically about our voting rights, about electoral college, all these conversations, elections today, what they mean, implications. Adults understand that 270, we're all looking for an election night with 2 kids. We've got to teach them that.
Man. just jump in or?
Go
Okay.
ahead, Dwayne.
Dr. James Harris, it's always a pleasure to hear you speak, and thanks
Thank
for
you.
coming this evening. Quick question regarding like one of my personal goals is to help the little I can to get Amistad into New Jersey's schools.
Mhm.
And so the question is, what method do we use to measure how much Amistad curriculum has permeated a school system? Is there like some sort of map or something like that? And I realize there's 619 districts, I guess, across us. There are 565, I believe, municipalities in this states. We have more districts than we have municipalities.
Mhm.
But is there like some sort of map or something, maybe some color coded thing or something that we could see to see how much a district has really adopted the Amistad curriculum?
So I will say that there is no universal. Unfortunately, we have model curriculum. And I think that becomes a base point in which to really begin to look at whether or not schools even adopted those particular endpoints. And when we created the model curriculum resource for teachers, we really thought about it and we kind of scalpeled and looked at an outline of what we thought would make students college career ready. And there was a number of us that sat around the room at the time that were all teaching in higher education. And so we all recognized those gaps in students' learning when they entered what we called the 13th grade. We all kind of jokingly and said, for that freshman year of college, we called 13th grade. And where is it the students all looked at us blank? Where is it that they all kind of look like, I have no idea what you're talking about. And so then we understood where those gaps were and we began to scaffold it back. So the model curriculum is, of course, is a really good space to start. But I will say specifically for Princeton, since I'm talking to Princeton, on Princeton's website, you all have a whole Amistad page where you talk about resources that will be in classrooms and lessons that will be learned and concepts and et cetera. I think you start there. You actually ask the school district, it was created internally by Princeton. I think it was drafted in 2016. So, and I have not seen any updates to it since 16. So what I will tell you oftentimes happens, and I don't know if it's happened in Princeton, but I will just give you the worst case scenario that has happens across the state. Is oftentimes the school district or school board does a great deal of work under a particular superintendent or a particular school board. And then you see shifts and changes in the school board representation or their superintendent. And so work that was done by one administration oftentimes lags under an additional one. And it might stay up as a pace of discourse, but it is not enforced because this particular superintendent or administration has its own sort of platform and priorities. And so Princeton has a space in which it says what it wants to be accountable for. You can Google it. I mean, I did. And so sometimes even just asking the question, is Princeton actually doing what Princeton actually said it was going to do? It's probably a good start.
Yeah, as a quick follow-up, if I may, this is more like I don't know if it's a suggestion or more of a comment than a question, but I just think it would be great if we had a means of policing school districts. I'm sure, resources is always a problem, but I almost wish we had a means of policing them so we can even see like a color-coded map. Like this is a green light district for Amistad because they're really into it and they're doing what they're supposed to do. This one is a red because they've done absolutely nothing type thing, or something like that. And sometimes I wonder if it would be effective to shame some of these districts into doing more. If
So I
there's
will
something
tell
like
you
that
that
was out
that has
there.
been the bane of my existence. And one of the things I love accountability policing, that becomes one of the things that we have tried, we've grappled with a question, and I oftentimes many nights stayed up trying to figure it out. The reality of our not having universal curricula, and because of the reality of local control, and because of the reality of each particular school district being able to create their own curriculum map, the only way we would do that is if we would have to enforce a statewide curricula. And I thought about it. I thought about, we've had conversations with legislatures about whether or not that is something we need to do. But if we go down that pike, is that something we want to do for all districts? Because it would mean that all districts would have to be, we couldn't just effectuate it for social studies. Maybe we could, maybe that would be the pilot. But the only way to police it is that there would be a universal, we would create a rubric that you actually measure it against. Because each school district has their own curriculum map, it means that each accountability structure or rubrics for enforcement or infusion becomes individualized. Now, CUSAC is giving us a window to at least make sure that they've had board adoptions. So that's our first sort of accountability structure, because we know that if the school districts never adopted it, and they've never even made it a serious, really push, in regards of infusing their curriculum at. And so, and we also understand that the power of those adoptions mean it goes in a wheelhouse. So we have been trying to track school board adoptions. The question becomes after that, where is the implementation? And the drill down for me means I also understand that there's a lot of times when the state comes in, there's papers that are shuffled. Papers that are shuffled does not necessarily translate to what goes into the seat. And so, you know, it becomes an even more difficult road that, you know, and challenge, which I'm always welcome to suggestions or whether or not anybody has, you know, whatever to try to think how we can get it to make sure that it happens to the students. I say that I think as a parent, a student, parent probably knows better than anyone whether or not this work is being done, because they know when they see these topics, these conversations and stuff being done. For example, you would know if it was be done well if your student came home and they say, Mom, you know who owner judge is? It's just as an example of the conversation we just had, right? Or that they matter of factly were able to tell you if you asked the question, or that they understood, you know, what kind of happened in these narratives and these stories. Because then you would understand that in the time in which they were discussing the president, it became a part of the conversation. So at some of the policing, I think is us as a community who have investments of students in the area, that we'll be able to see the shifts and the changes.
Thanks.
You're welcome.
Layden, you want to go next?
Thank you, Doctor, for being here, and thank you all for being here. My question is twofold, really on a local advocacy level. What I find amazing is the research you've done and the fact that we're targeting right here where most of us are on this call from is right here in Princeton. We have several local people here who I've identified, and I think that we could quite possibly, with the people just on this phone, mount a local advocacy group for the Amistad experiment. But my real issue is that part of the, you know, and let me also say that in 1955, 1956, I started school in the middle of the Princeton system right here. And I attended Stony Brook School. I attended Little Brook. I attended Community Park, Johnson Park, Valley Road. So every school in Princeton I've attended as part of the very early Princeton system. And my question is now where we are at nationally, how do we in today's environment simultaneously push the Amistad curriculum while pushing back on the attempt to rid the whole nation of our true form of history in so many ways, in so many states, and so many processes, the democratic process, what we see going on in states. It appears to me that it would be a hard needle to thread, quite possibly even right here in Princeton, to be honest. And I think certainly if you look at the state of New Jersey, I think it would be a tough sell throughout many kind of suburban, non-urban districts. But I guess my question is, how would you advise us to do both of those things simultaneously? Or are both of those simultaneously too much of a handle, and maybe we should just push right here locally in Princeton to get it infused into our school system?
So I don't think it's too much of a handle. I do think that I think that for each community, it's always very important to concentrate and make sure it does in your community, because if every community does it, then we can see that we can do the community efforts and galvanize across the state. What I will say is that, you know, interestingly enough, I think the rise in understanding and the fact that we have deconstructed so many histories, demystified them, and really done a deep dive and analysis on including other narratives into the history is actually why we're seeing such large pushback. There's always pushback when we have movement, right? And so the reality that we are now entering spaces where people are becoming aware, people that have been educated in another system, which is actually, you know, because the folks that are complaining about it are not the students. Not the students.
Right.
Adults that were institutionalized and really educated under a system in which these narratives were not discussed, were not touched, were not taught, were not even understood, and where the invisibility factor for so many people in regards to their history and the contexts of their history were unincluded, are the ones that are pushing back on the gains and the inclusion of those narratives. And they actually become, for me, becomes an indication that we're actually striking the right chord. because understanding that the reality that they are uncomfortable conversations for those that want to still make them invisible. They're not uncomfortable conversations for folks that want to have students educated. So the actuality that we're in a space where people are banning. I mean, books are supposed to open your world. They're supposed to, for most of us, that we're book readers and book lovers as children, we went places that we would have never seen in the globe. We immersed ourselves in book. We understood other people's experiences. I still empathize and sympathizes with other people. I love historical fiction. That's my favorite genre of book, because even as an adult, it places me in times and spaces and in situations through the magic of authorship to be able to live in other spaces. And it makes me much more conscious and conscientious of how other people have had to live or see the world. And yet we're banning them because we don't want our students to have that opportunity. We're at a critical juncture. And so understanding that the galvanization for all of those weaponizing actors right now are being galvanized by public policy means that we have got to be really vigilant about also effectuating and making sure that the public policy that we do have, actually, we don't allow to be rolled back. Now, one of the beautiful things about New Jersey, and even with all of its, New Jersey is the fifth most segregated state in the nation. I know that for a lot of people, they can't even conceive of that. New Jersey, by virtue of its racial segregation, its mandates, its municipalities, its property taxes. There's a whole plethora of things that we don't see. But it is the reality of it being the fifth most segregated state in the nation in regards to residential areas, which also, because of the reality of our school districts following residential lines, makes our school districts, a lot of them almost what we would consider apartheid state. Everybody hates that word because they immediately cringe because they think of South Africa. But the reality of a lot of students in the state of New Jersey going to schools that are either 95% of one race or ethnicity or another is a significant reality in New Jersey. Look at our communities. How many of them are not integrated? How many neighborhoods and neighborhood schools are not integrated? And so if they're galvanizing around public policy in our school boards and all these kind of things and really pushing back for New Jersey, the duty of the Amistad law is that a school board cannot override a mandate that is a state law. And whether or not they want to ignore it or not, our state actually having this law is probably going to save us from a lot of the local edicts that are happening in other states because they don't have the law. There's no school district or city hall or city council or mayor that is going to be able to mandate that they can't. This has to be taught. This law is not going away, and it is a mandate, and it is codified in 18A, just like science or mathematics or the likes. And so we are actually in a better status, and so it is to our credit to move forward and actually lead the way so that we can actually show states how to roll back the tide at this juncture.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Denise, did you ask your question in the chat or do you want to say it verbally?
My question is in the chat, and we've begun to speak a bit about it. Thank you for this wonderful evening. Really
Thank you.
appreciate what you've added here. Banning books, critical race theory being weaponized. Where is Governor Murphy? Are there going to be policy statements? Is the focal point school boards? Do we have to go and get on some of these school boards so that we can make sure and watch that none of that nonsense goes on in the state of New Jersey? What's your, where are you on what's going on?
I'll tell you that my entry onto the school board, because I stopped the superintendent when we first moved to this town. I live in Merchantville. I'm not that far away. And when I first moved to the town and my children started school, I stopped to introduce myself as a parent. I didn't even tell them I worked for the Department of Ed, didn't tell them I was the executive director, didn't tell them what I was doing. I started asking some questions about curriculum and he had no answers for me and off. And then I called the curriculum office and they shooed me off. And so I said, okay, this is what I'm gonna have to do. Showed up at a school board meeting and the next thing you knew, I was on the school board. And it was for me to be able to be a guardsman for my children's education, it meant that level of involvement. And so I think that the more that we engage in this work, I'm not suggesting everybody joins the school board, but I'm just saying that I think that we at least need to be cognizant of what's going on at those meetings, right? You know, we would be horrified if we found out tomorrow that every school board or the school board of Princeton decided that they really didn't care anymore about kids having heart attacks in schools, and so they mandated taking all the defibrillators out of the building. You guys would think they were crazy. And yet we are not conscious of the decisions that are made. It might have been that somebody made a presentation or somebody just made a vote and they just voted on it and it's done. But once those mandates are made, when those votes are taken, they do make critical changes to what happens to the students in your community. And so we do need to be aware of it. And I will tell you, as a school board member, I mean, we knew it was something hot going on in the town, because on most school board meetings, it was 5 people in the room with us. We were working in silo. And so people don't come to those meetings. People don't even show. I mean, if school board election is not added to a general election in most terms, you know, school board, they might have 1,000 votes in totality. And so advocacy is really, really, really important. I mean, you know, even the reality of, you know, the list of books in which they're read, you can make suggestions. Parents, you can make a suggestion of a book that you might think that, you know, whatever the worst case scenario, the library, you know, their library team or the curriculum team will review the book and find out. But even to find out what books are in the library, what resources are there for the students to even learn some of these histories, who's included. It's important. It's really important, because we're shaping our kids' worlds more so than we think every day.
Thank you.
You're
Thank you.
welcome.
Catherine, do you want to go?
Aha, successfully unmuted.
Hi.
Thank you for this great talk and these great points. As a retired teacher, I really understand what you're saying about siloing and having everything filtered through special holidays and so on. I don't love this tool that's used on teachers to cause them to teach certain things, but it certainly seems to make everybody more alert when they know that they're teaching to a standardized test. Would you talk a little bit about the role of standardized tests for good or bad in the Amistad campaign?
So one of the things that first became apparent to me is that we didn't have a standardized test that we could actually teach to. It probably would have made, and I, you know, as a teacher myself, I didn't like the idea of creating questions that would force teachers to teach it, but I knew that it, you know, we usually will teach to the test. At least we'll make sure that our students are at level so that they can actually be able to do proficiency or above competency for statewide exams. There is no statewide testing for New Jersey for social studies. We don't have any. And so because New Jersey's social studies
That's right.
area for so first question I asked when I took, okay, well, wait, let me see, you know, can I talk to the assessments office? There is no assessments for social studies, So because there's no assessment, we could not even add tests into the parameters as an arsenal. It probably would have been very effective, honestly, at least to force teachers to understand that this is something they needed to handle. And it probably would have actually forced textbooks companies to actually think about how to infuse it, you know, in regards of how to make sure that this was included. But since we don't have it, what we found is that some districts, and most especially actually when we had the park, because it was teaching skills and allows an expansion of sort of curricula to actually be able to layer for students to get to the skills, they had to know multiple kind of facets of content knowledge. And those are familiar with the shift from the standards before to the Common Core standards and these park assessments is that one of them was based on content knowledge. The other moved to skills and how to apply content knowledge. It is a higher order thinking skill, but it also requires that you make an assumption that students already have all the content knowledge to be able to do, which is why it became so problematic for a lot of school districts, because for some of them, it might have been a given, but to assess the student on having to analyze the, pull out the similarities and differences and the, declaration of principles, the Declaration of Independence and, and the declaration, the Haitian Revolution, right? means that they have to understand all of them happen at the same time, understand the context of all three of them, understand what these documents say, understand the Enlightenment. There's a lot of context that they have to get there, as opposed to asking the students the question of what these things were. And so the PARC assessments actually gave us a little more leeway, because we understood that there had to be some layering that needed to be done. And so we actually were able to create some district benchmarks to assist with some district benchmarks that actually allowed that knowledge to be much more integrated. So districts have created some benchmarks, and I have actually looked at districts' benchmarks to think about additional questions to make sure that they could kind of check what students were learning, and making sure that even some larger scale concepts were being included. I don't know if Princeton has a benchmark test that has been infused. I can't remember off the top of my head, but I'm sure somebody will be able to answer you if you ask them at the school district level.
Thank you.
You're
Ying, would you like to go next?
Sure. Can you hear me?
I can, Ying. How are you?
Yeah, good, good. Thank you so much, Dr. James Harris. It was such a great talk. I learned so much.
Oh, thank
And
you.
I just also want to thank you, because there are several of us from Make Us Visible, New Jersey, and we're very excited about the passing of AAPI law. And we can't wait to learn from you. And this is such an informational session.
Oh, thank
And
you.
yeah, my question is about back to that accountability, because it's so complex, right? And the New Jersey is so decentralized. It's just exactly as you were just answering the other person's question, read standardized testing, or even a New Jersey-wide assessment. I'm just also wondering, I understand there isn't one right now, right? And also when you think about teacher professional development, right, the credits. And today I heard in some school district, when they talk about which courses to be added to the honors class, right? There's a decision about, whether there's a course related to race and equity versus, something like an international business, right? And the district made a decision of priority one than the other. So I'm just wondering, first of all, right, do you have any, based on your experience, was there any practices or anything statewide that we can pull in terms of accountability? And secondly, whether do you think there's space for more legislation to further strengthen this, right? To
Oh God, yes. So my first, I mean, when we went to the Make Us Visible, I know when we had a conversation, we talked a lot about legislation, and I know I shared a lot of sort of legislative history. The reality of Amistad, there was actually about 5 or 6 different packages that we actually wanted to see passed, to accompany it. Almost immediately after actually kind of looking at the operationalization of the law, specifically because at the time in which we were doing legislation, first of all, this is the first state law that actually effectuated a content area like this. And so there was so little sort of ground that we were treading on before anybody had treaded on before, because it's one thing to say, we want to pass a law, whatever, but because we didn't have central curriculum, nobody thought about that. So nobody ever thought about what it would look like, the accountabilities, or how we would roll it out across the state. It sounded good, but no one even realized the pragmatics of like school board adoptions. It didn't even occur to most of the legislators. The hurdles, the bureaucratic hurdles, particularly because of the state of New Jersey, that would have to be encountered. So one of the other pieces of legislation that I have always strongly suggested is in regards to professional development for teachers and teacher preparedness. Is that one of my most, I guess it irks me so much because of the reality of certification, is that for most of the teachers, even to get certified in New Jersey, they never even have to take a coursework. So you've got teachers in the state, for science, and we all know, nobody is going to get into and say, well, we're going to hire her to teach science. So we figured, we're going to give her the science book, and maybe she'll teach, if she's never she's never taken a biology class, but we know she can do science. We know she's never took a physics class, but we know she can do science. We wouldn't do that, right? So the reality of her social studies certification is there is no requisite to take any of this particular coursework, even as an undergrad. So they can graduate out with never even sitting in a course for any of these histories, and then enter into New Jersey classroom, and are challenged to teach it when they've never even, a lot of times, only learning the knowledge from the textbook. And we already know the textbook doesn't do it well unless they are challenged in, as an individual, that they want to go do professional development. And then how do you really push enough professional development? And you're right, I saw that most of the Southern texts, I can tell you all about this. Textbooks have been, that's another bane of my existence. That's why we created the web-based curriculum resource, because the textbooks were horrendous. So there wasn't a space for that. So one of the things is absolutely that we need to be able to look at coursework, and we need to think about strategizing the pre-service programs to make sure that this coursework is included. Because even if we trained and we got every teacher to understand it by May, in September, there's a new bastion of teachers that enter into the force, right? And the secondary one, of course, will be about central purchasing. There's nothing that says we can't have a central purchasing office. We have purchasing office for everything. So we might not be able to centralize curricula, but we could centralize purchasing. And the purchasing power of New Jersey with our sheer numbers would shift the discourse of whether or not textbooks paid attention. Now, I'm not advocating. I think we've gone around the textbook question, and I think that we've created enough resources ourselves that we can supply school districts. And we've moved so far away from standardized textbooks, in the way in which we have been utilizing them in the classroom these days, that it's not the answer that it might have been in 2007 or 2008 or 2010 or 12. But the reality of us not having central purchasing means that each school board also has the power to choose their own textbook, which means that a lot of the textbook companies, even if they're working, Prince Hall and all of them right here in Jersey, well, guess what? Guess who has central purchasing? Texas, California. So guess what? When the Texas school board, which is also a universal for the entire state, passes something that dictates something, most of the time, the pushback is whether or not it's adopted into the textbook. And we've heard the stories, we've seen the photographs about, language that has been added into textbook because the Texas school board said they wanted, I believe the word was, instead of slaves, they wanted them to be called immigrant workers or something ridiculous into the language of the textbooks, which of course the textbook company said, of course, was a faux pas, but we know better than that. Because that they've got billions of dollars behind a district or a statewide that is going to build the textbooks, buy the textbooks. I think we'll see the discourse in a lot of those materials. So we need, I'm thinking another one might be central purchasing, which of course will help effectuate. And then I think that there should be some criteria in regards to evaluation. So, but oftentimes if we can't catch it with curriculum mapping, we can catch it with teachers. So we're oftentimes using evaluative tools for professional development and things with teachers. We could add some of this language, most especially in this content area, to see whether or not regionalization is another one, right? Regionalization would at least cut down on the numbers of school districts and curriculum maps and curriculums that we have to deal with, right? If you're, for example, I went to college in New Jersey, in Maryland, and I have a number of friends that graduated with me that are now administrators and principals, and in the central offices of the county offices in Maryland. There's 5 or 6 of them surrounding DC, as opposed to the 600 plus that are here, right? So when you have centralized offices, that means that you can effectuate much more school districts, and you don't have this level of work in the deep dive having to happen in each one of these little hamlets. It happens broadly. And so it would make a big shift in regards to the discourse of how those are mean. But all those things are kind of solutions, and it has to, I think the first time in the last 2 years, because of the reality of the pandemic, it's the first time we've actually kind of even thought about restructuring education and thinking outside the box. So for a long time, it kind of felt like we were going up against the fight against trying to keep things status quo, but also shifted. I think we kind of, everything fell apart. So maybe we have some room to not try to cling back to what was our old normal, but move towards some new normals and think about having to solve some of these issues. And by the way, this conversation about integration and Princeton and regional schools, because of that state constitution that I said, there's a piece of legislation that's right now a legal case against the state of New Jersey in regards to school districts and its segregated policies in regards to its township lines. And so I'm curious as to see how it ends up being resolved, because they're going to have to make some shifts and changes to allow these school district borders because all of the students that are suing were high performing students that were right on the border of a high achieving school district that were shut out of it because of their zip code. So we'll see.
Thank you, thank you. And you just also remind me of this notion as equity by design, or other ways inequality rise from design. So I really appreciate your perspective. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And our last question will be Eileen.
Like everyone else, I want to say thank you, thank you, thank you. But first, also, I have two questions. One is, so in terms of accountability, is there any way, I had seen something at one point about if school districts didn't, weren't, if they didn't match up with Amistad, is there a way, like there was talk about penalizing the school districts? Is there any way to, cut funding, or would we need more funding in order to evaluate how well they were doing? Or is it just impossible because it's so, each district is so different? So that's one kind of long-winded, not very precise question.
No, I got it. I
And
understand.
okay, and then just quickly, my second one is, well, the idea about teacher training, could we push for legislation to require for a teacher to be licensed or whatever in New Jersey?
That was the exact idea.
Yeah, that
Coursework, because when I have conversations with colleges of education, oftentimes their reasoning is that they've created such a tight schedule that they don't give students a lot of options in regards to their electives. But they could shift to look at how they are even framing their courses so that they could be done in other departments across the university that could allow these courses or this content to be included. And that is often not the case. And so the legislation, that was the actual piece of legislation that we had, it never made it out of committee.
okay.
And it kind of died.
Okay.
Every once in a while, a legislator will call me and ask me about it, and I'll send it to him again. I've never seen it make it back out of committee. I've seen it have a couple of gyrations of conversations,
Yeah.
but never made it out of committee, education committee. Your first question, nothing is ever impossible. So we're not going to say that. We just got to figure it out. So if everybody likes me, spends some sleepless nights and then calls me, we might come up with this answer. There's enough brilliance on this call. I'm sure we could do it. In regards to accountability, the QSAC, as I mentioned before, gives us probably the most teeth. And not specifically on Amistad, but just because it is a zero-sum game for curriculum points. So the QSAC review, the school districts go through, it actually it's in 5 components. I think it's like fiscal, and one of them's like governance, and the points for curriculum and instruction. There are 80 points that they get. 20, I'm sorry, it's 20 points for each area. So the 20 points for that one. And if they do not, you cannot say, well, we did great in math, but we didn't do good in social studies, or we did good in science. It's a zero sum. So if any of them are missing, you lose all the points. If you're at an 80, that means you're in school, you're in a school in need of improvement. And it also means that you have to go through a remediation plan. And the reality of how New Jersey has structured its belief systems about the hierarchy of our high performing school district means that no school district, most especially one that has been seen as one that is very good, wants to ever be in any kind of remediation. And so we're not holding back funds. However, nobody wants to know that you've now moved to a town that is in remediation because you've lost your curriculum points. Not when I pay the kind of property taxes I pay for my students to be here. So by sort of de facto, that becomes probably our biggest weapon in our arsenal in regards of evaluation. So that in turn has been really the mechanism that we have used. Now, what I've also found is that it's also gave me the most space to be able to assist districts, because my goal is never to penalize without trying to first help. And so, it has given me the door sometimes to be able to open the door and say, hey, listen, let me evaluate, let me assist you, let me So let us come in, let us look as a team at your work, let us look at your professional developments. Let me give you some suggestions of maybe some other professional providers who can come in and do stuff with your teachers, or some other resources, or curricula that might be added to these conversations. Most of the districts are open to that much more than they were before, because they know that regardless of what happens, they all got to go through CUSAC. So there's no way out, right? So that really becomes it. And I think the parents and the community members end up being the policers of that, because we all know we spend too much money in taxpayer dollars for our kids to be in these school districts, to hear that we lost points for curricula. Not when we want our children to end up in higher education settings that are going to be contingent on the opinions of our school districts.
Well, yeah, and in terms of parents, that's one thing that I've heard is that if we talk to the teachers and ask them what professional courses they've taken, and if they haven't taken anything from Amistad or on racial literacy or anything, well, why not? And when are you going to? And to maybe push the Board of Education or the school board to require it for, they
have like, there's like 10 or 15 full professional development days. And these teachers take all kinds of stuff. Just the fact of even expanding the offerings for a particular cohort of teachers, even making sure that those professional days are dedicated to the work, speaks volumes in regards of how much you're going to expand teachers even having the ability to know what it is, what available resources or whatever. And so many of them for years did not avail themselves of any of those professional development. Teachers would have to come outside of the professional days for our trainings, not as a part of their professional days. That speaks volumes in regards of how the school district is actually taking the integrity of the law.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. And I am so sorry, I have like blown up all of your your schedule and your itinerary. I've shifted the discourse tonight, right? It's 8:30 and no small groups, no nothing. So I apologize for that.
We are grateful. Absolutely. Shelley Krause.
Well, first of all, let me just add my voice to the chorus of gratitude. We're so fortunate to have Dr. James Harris leading the charge and being such a stalwart and inspiring leader on this front. So I know I speak for everybody on the call. I am one of the members of the board of Not in Our Town Princeton. Thanks to everybody who came out tonight and who has stuck with us through this very energizing and exciting time together. I do have a few sort of housekeeping announcements, and I want to encourage you. I'm going to speak quickly and directly and then send you back out into your evening full of energy that I hope you take back into your home communities, into your conversations tomorrow. Let's break through some of those silos together. A week and a day from today, so on Tuesday, February 15th, you'll see if you spend some time on the Princeton Public Library site that the library is offering a discussion entitled Black Activism Then and Now, which will use famed Princeton resident Paul Robeson as one of several anchors to explore questions about activism now and in the future. It's going to be a great conversation. The panelists include Meena Jagarath, who is the director of global programs at Movement Law Lab, our own Reverend Lukata Mujumbe, who is the pastor of our Witherspoon Street Presbyterian Church here and is a past presenter here at Continuing Conversations. A third panelist is activist and author Dr. Shana Redmond, who is the author of several books, including the 2020 book, Everything Man, The Form and Function of Paul Robeson. It's going to be a great program. And it's, once again, that's Tuesday, February 15th at 7 p.m. Registration right here, as you did for this program, through the Princeton Public Library website. So I just want to commend that to folks' attention. As Connie mentioned at the beginning of our time together, we're so happy that Dr. James Harris has offered to provide some free professional development on the Amistad curriculum as a sort of extension of this evening's program. We haven't firmed up the date and time yet, but it'll be in the last week of February. We're super grateful for Dr. James Harris's kindness and generosity in this. And I know that you all have people in your circle that you're thinking, okay, I have to make sure that this person attends. So make a little note for yourself and then come back to the website. We are notinourtownprinceton.org. So NIOT towmprinceton.org. We'll post the information there. We'll probably send out an email as well. And then finally, our continuing conversations continue, right? So our next continuing conversation slated for Monday, March 7th at 7 p.m., again, virtually in these same kinds of spaces. This is a really a great reflection of individual response to societal context. So when the horrific anti-Black events of 2020 made headlines in this country and around the world, the leadership at many companies, including Intel, were jolted into a higher level of awareness of racism in US society. And they took a range of actions, including some public acknowledgement of racism and its impacts. And then there was a kind of now what moment. A few employees at Intel came together to create PIE, Partners for Inclusion and Equity, which is an organization focused on white supremacy and anti-racism, somewhat similar to our own mission. And two PIE leaders, including our own board member, Sindhu, who is here tonight on the conversation, will present how PIE was started, its vision, its objectives, the initiatives and activities that it's undertaken, the member responses, the community responses, and some ideas about what they see as being their next iteration. So a goal of that presentation will be to motivate others to create similar initiatives in their own workplaces. And we want to encourage everyone to consider adding that to their calendars as well. So once again, please take this energy home with you tonight. Stay up and think about it, dream about it, build into the next chapter, and continue these conversations in your communities, because that's how change happens. Thank you once again to Dr. Stephanie James Harris for her time with us this evening.
Absolutely. And I was putting my phone number in the office in the chat and my information. I just think it's been so long in and out of the office. I had to actually go look at my office phone number to find it. So I'm going to list it here and our contact information in the office if anybody needs to reach us.
Fantastic. As they say, be careful what you offer, lest it be asked.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much, Shelley. Thank you so much, Not in Our Town. Thank you so much, Dr. James Harris. I'm getting so many texts saying how wonderful this event has been, and how grateful people have been to share this time with all of you. Have a wonderful evening.
Everybody have a good night. Take care.
Right.
Thank you.